Okay, so in the third part of this week's content, we're talking specifically now about selfies and your current project on that. So we're going to look at a little bit more kind of data quotes in here because you're actually collecting data still at the moment, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about sociology of selfies.
Sure. So, yeah, this project is about not just selfies themselves, but the specific practice of editing them and the apps and new tools that exist to change appearance through selfies. So there's been lots of research done in youth sociology and digital new media sociology about selfies more broadly, about how they're, important social practices for young people. But the main way that I'm coming to this is through trying, I guess, similar to with the body image theories that I've been talking about earlier in the lecture, where, people's self-image concerns are seen as being, just pathologies a lot of the time, an individual problem that just need to recover somehow, a better way of thinking, and you'll be fine. Make better choices. Coming from that similar kind of critical perspective to look at how selfies and young people's practices are often already spoken about in really pathologized terms and seen as being like risk behaviors. They're really wanting to decenter that kind of understanding of selfies.
Yeah.
But to also look at the appearance-based pressures that are real, that are built into not just the practices, but into the technology. So Noble and others talked about, bodily ideals that are gendered and racialized being baked into the technology. So a tech designer will decide what a face should look like when you press the pretty button. And so someone's deciding for you what femininity should look like. Which is a particular or potentially a really different way of having to negotiate these gendered norms that we've already been talking about. So what happens if they're not just something that you can sense is real and kind of negotiate? What if it's just like literally applied to your face?
Yeah.
And
this kind of relates to much of the other work around the world at the moment, around AI and stuff like that, about how like sexism and racism are built into these things from the very start. Whether it's the data that's fed in, the literature that's fed in, and the terms of the editing you're talking here, it's kind of normative beauty and whiteness.
Exactly.
Are the norms. Yeah.
So they're even more sort of intensively communicated in that if they're in that technology form, because it's already part of your life. You're already using these things. So what happens if, how do people negotiate those norms?
Yeah. That's
really what we're asking, and the apps is sort of the vehicle to do that analysis.
Okay, so throughout the next part, we're just going to look at some what your respondents have been saying. So presenting an ideal life, which relates again back to the wellness and the bodywork and the feminist stuff we've been talking about. This is a similar thing being expressed through editing of selfies. Yeah,
exactly. So they were talking about sort of the challenges in Instagram and how and when they decide to share photos, feeling like it was already such a platform where ideal lives are the currency, right? So Paige talked about how there's two types of selfies. One is to communicate with a friend in Snapchat, which is like obviously a private way to communicate, and the others are to show who you're with more socially, to make sure that people know you look good, or that you're feeling good. So it's the look good, feel good thing again. But you want people to know that you're feeling good, and the way they'll know you're feeling good is if you look good. So it's just like it's all kind of so circular and combined in there. But Jared also talked about having a picturesque picture of social life, and talked about the way he would comport his body to communicate again that you're feeling good, you're having fun, having a good time, and having a beautiful life, similar to the participant that I think it was Penny was talking about in the last presentation.
So shoulder blades together, chest up.
Yeah, exactly. And Grace is an influencer herself, or a budding one. The last quote there talks about how she creates carefully curated casual posts through TikTok. She's, posting heaps of content about her life and little day in the life ofs. And because she's planning to launch a product, so she's trying to get a base. But she's deliberately she's looking at her lifestyle and her everything in her life from that critical view of, is this gonna make people want to envy my lifestyle, because they have to, because this is how I'm going to sell them my stuff.
Obviously the juxtaposition there between carefully and casual is
a lot of irony and reflexivity and all that stuff in there.
So one of the kind of conceptual things you're bringing out of this is this idea of kind of this forensic gauge of the self, really, and not just the self and the body, but also that broader lifestyle stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Very much extending from the post-feminist literature of Ros Gill and Angela McRobbie that we've already looked at. Social media scholars have talked about the sort of forensic gaze that already existed as part of femininity to appraise the body and to decide if it was going to communicate in the way that was going to accord them value, because that being a obviously important thing of femininity. The digital forensic gaze is what they're talking about, is how that operates through the scrutinizing of photographs of the self or selfies. But then that informs the editing practices. And I've got one of the methods I'm using is people will screen record on their phone and show me how they edit. And just the tiny micro edits, they'll just bring in the cheek here, and just it's such tiny fine-grained edits that unless they'd showed me how they were doing it, I wouldn't have known it was edited. That's the whole idea, is it should be seen as it shouldn't be obvious.
So the forensic gauge is to ensure that you don't look like some kind of Stepford wife kind of thing going on. It's like to ensure that it's still kind of realistic. You don't look like a cyborg.
Yeah, well, it has to look natural, because if people know you've edited, then it's seen as a real huge sort of shame aspect, which it's really interesting to think through in relation to the kind of demands of femininity already, which is we already talked about how kind of knife edge it all is and paradoxical. This is just like a whole other level. But using all of those skills, all those sort of supposedly natural capacities related to gender, to be able to see things in a particular way, but then like bringing it out even more with the editing.
Okay. And another aspect is this kind of need to express, I suppose, how I'm feeling it in the moment, right at the moment. Yeah.
So connecting to the kind of affective lens I've already discussed. So definitely looking at embodiment and the significance of affect and sensations, feelings as part of this process to try to understand what's actually going on. So the kind of transient or ephemeral is a word that participants use, which is great, to describe the process of orienting the self through image, through selfies, and also through the editing process. They're trying to capture how they're feeling in the moment, but that feeling is so fleeting that this participant page talks about choosing a photo to post. She takes videos of herself so she can scroll through frame by frame and find the precise, again, that forensic gaze thing. So she's able to pinpoint the frame where she looks the way she wants to portray she feels. It's so highly tuned to be able to read and to not just appraise how she feels and wants to be read, but knowing how others will read her.
Right. So there's a kind of big other going on here too. That's filtered through. It's not just the way that she feels. She feels. She's oriented towards the way she feels others will feel.
Well, she knows she knows the rules of the game really well, right? So she was the one who was talking before about you want people to know that you're feeling good. That was her. So she is able to know what frame will be coded by others as her feeling good.
So good feelings, radiate through the photo. That's a kind of goal.
Yeah, exactly. So they radiate. It's slightly different for Janet. They radiate for her. She talks about feeling like $1 million when she got her hair cut, and that she would just feel good for weeks after she'd been able to really nail it, to not just and I guess it's nailing it in a very specific register, right, of femininity, of particular normative all those kind of appearance ideals that we
So the
talked about
selfie
already.
made her feel good, or the haircut?
The haircut felt great. So
Yeah.
then she documented it through the selfie,
Yeah.
and she was able to capture it so well
Yeah.
that it was really, it then kind of duplicated, or
Yeah.
like it extended out
When she looked at it again.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because she was able to capture it so well. And sometimes the participants talk about sometimes if they feel like they're like, yes, I look great, like this is, I definitely want to capture this, and they can't get it. And that's like, they're like, why don't, it's like this really big moment of like dissonance is another word they use, where they can't capture the feeling that they or the image that they want to portray. And it's a real source of a lot of tension and concern and frustration. Yeah. But in this one, it reverberates for weeks. So yeah, they talked a lot about the actual practices or the things that they would edit in editing selfies. Some people, or many, talked about doing just really subtle, not huge edits that would change, the shape of their face or anything drastic, but most commonly, removing acne or smoothing the skin, or just using those very sort of subtle filters, removing freckles or putting freckles on, or editing the light or the saturation of the image, which could also kind of do some of that smoothing work just through changing the light. Or even talked about just using the flash on their camera. They would talk about, that's editing because it changes, it just flattens all the saturation. So they're like, that's editing. I'm learning a lot.
So there's a kind of, you're making a distinction here between kind of, blemish kind of things as opposed to kind of structural changes to the face.
Yeah. And that was usually a distinction they would make. Lots of participants who were, 18, 19, 20 would talk about how they used to do really dramatic edits when they were 15, 16, but they don't do it anymore because it can be taken too far, because then you stop looking like yourself. If someone runs into you in the street, they'll be like, you don't look like you. I thought you were this. That really kind of jarring of identity or self, because, through the bodywork thing,
I wonder if that relates to like authenticity in the sense of, 15 is probably not child, but like it's still kind of more cartoonish and, like those kind of weird cartoony filters, as opposed to like as you get older, you become there's a kind of need to be more authentic in terms, I suppose, how you present yourself. It can't be cartoonish.
Yeah, well, I think they were more talking about the structural edits are the ones that are really about about the kind of cosmetic surgery kinds of edits, where you change the shape of your face, change your nose, change the range is really incredible. But they were sort of aware that the structural editing, they kind of had a lot of the same awareness of as being really similar to cosmetic surgery, because it and I think often surgeons do use these editing tools in their surgeries because that's what they can show someone they're going to look like afterwards.
So it's interesting, it's kind of editing itself creates insecurities and false realities. They're kind of cognizant of this, and there's a management of that process going on.
Absolutely. And Jenna, who was the one before talking about how the good photo reverberated for weeks, she used to edit her structure, which was basically meant she used to change the width of her shoulders, I think, or size of arms. That structural edits are when you like literally take like flesh or content away. And she felt she did it just twice, and both times she said she felt so much guilt for posting it, she deleted them. And she's never just like won't do it again. So it's got this boundary around, I won't change anything structural or anything really significant.
And Lucy talks like there's a slippery slope kind of thing that happens.
There's, again, really affective language around this, and I keep finding this same line this year in the project, second year. If you start spiraling, you won't be able to stop. People talk about the spiral as being like a vortex kind of thing that you want, that you won't be able to pull yourself out of. And from the kind of theory way that I'm looking at it, that's like classic affect, like creating effective relation or an effective attachment that is really difficult to break out of. not because of there's something wrong with their brain or some kind of, you know, they're not because they're not living in reality or something, but there is something very specific about the social and cultural conditions that enable this to be a potential relation to form.
And is spiraling something that actually happens, or is it a kind of a folk devil-y kind of thing that you just don't want to do? You know, this kind of...
Well, I think it is something, because I've spoken to, like, there is definitely that kind of moral panic around it, or like that that thing where it occupies a kind of strange cultural space of this kind of addictive practice. That's how they speak about it. But there are people who have come out of it and say, I can't, if I start going doing this a little bit, I can feel it. I can feel it happening again. Slippery slope. They use all those kind of metaphors and things again.
And so this is some data here about the different use of gender and racial filters.
Yeah, so we were interested to ask them about the kind of baked in gendered and racialized norms that we know are in the machine already. And we wanted to talk about, we wanted to know if people kind of, like disrupted them, or like would just, you know, tease them, or be like, oh, this is ridiculous, if they'd make fun of it instead of it just being this like straightforward thing that's imprinted on people. Wanted to know how they negotiated it. And they're highly skilled at reading what is appropriate or not, like what works or just doesn't work with their faces. So often the participants who have from China or have Asian, you know, heritage would talk about, oh, this feels wrong, and then it would be like, oh no, this looks ridiculous. So they would tend to use apps that are, you know, originated from China, for example, like Me Too, which have like Asian filters on them, and they would usually steer away from the Western filters because it would kind of make aggressive, or others say offensive, kind of changes to their face. And all kinds of things around different skin whitening and all those kinds of norms that are built in. So
so they're cognizant of those things and don't really want to kind of move away from how they look in terms of relation to their own ethnicity. And they're wary of it. But they're not so concerned maybe when it comes to kind of the kind of normative beauty standards. So that there's a kind of line there somewhere that's in the mix that they're reflexive about.
I think the ways that normative beauty standards they kind of do work along different racialized lines, you know, but they kind of seem to just kind of generally accept them because they're being presented in such a straightforward way. Right. Like there are so many options that it's just kind of assumed that you're playing. If you're using these apps, you're playing along. Like you're agreeing this is ideal, and you're in. Right.
And in relation to that, there's kind of instances of editing fails.
Exactly. So we also spoke to some people who weren't that into editing and who actively would never do it and actively avoid it. But also there's definitely like a real cultural line around fakeness and wanting to avoid coming across as someone who's superficial or vain narcissistic or any of those sorts of things. And editing was seen as like a real flag that signal those. So editing fails would be if someone had obviously edited so that they could see like a warped part of the body. You know, there's all these very
Photoshop fail kind of
Photoshop fail
things.
Yeah, exactly. And they would just see it as sort of an excessive, and usually always coded with femininity as excess, right? Which is a very, very kind of straight up and down feminist critique of women being seen as the excess emotion of.
It's kind of, we know that there's kind of editing going on, but like if you go too far, it's not authentic.
Exactly. Whereas there's so much work and time goes into it. So that kind of boundary is really interesting for me.
It's like almost if you spend less time, you're more likely to mess it up. And therefore will be less authentic. You've got to spend more time, you've got to do it properly.
It requires more expertise.
Okay. So you're moving here towards thinking about some of the editing as a form of bodywork.
I'm trying to think this through a little bit more at the moment in the analysis, but because of the gendered or just physical appearance and modifications required to try to meet an ideal is such a part of bodywork. I think self-editing really can be seen as just another practice or another tool that has all these kind of other associations or important things to analyze in it because of the, you know, the machine aspects of it, and the ways that they've been created by someone, and how they are negotiated. Because people will read themselves through the interactive mirror, as it kind of is, like, you know, being able to see your face and body move through the filters. It potentially does change your orientation to yourself. And they talk about there being this real incongruence between then the image of self, which feels real and is real, but then there is that boundary of the physical body. So and you know what happens, the slippery slope thing that others talk about is in this example from Abigail, feeling like her edited appearance was the person she really wanted to be, but then it was such a gap because she had done such intensive editing to her physical body that it really creates all kinds of, I mean, there's a lot of ugly feeling analysis to be done here that I haven't done yet, but it really was just impacting her life in every way. So she was suffering at uni, couldn't maintain proper relationships, feeling terrible all the time, and it was just this, like, that this is what that vortex is, that it can lead to these really restricted affective relations where it just can take over and become impossible to kind of find a way out of.
So relates to this kind of your edited selfie is not you.
And that's what Abigail knew as well. She's like, I know this isn't me, but what do I do if I want this to be me so badly? And Abigail had cosmetic surgery, which is a known, like, something else I've studied in my previous work, where that can also become like another kind of cycle that is impossible to break out of, because you're always that kind of, it's like the perfect storm of neoliberal conditions of wellness, gender, post-feminism, right? Is always aspiring. Always aspiring, always striving, and, you know, never set.
Always never satisfied.
Never ending.
Okay. So to finish off, what can you tell us to sum up on your work so far on selfies? It's kind of work in progress. It is.
I think, it's been interesting going through it all together as part of these lectures to tie these threads together. So, you know, all these conditions, like I was just saying, of the wellness conditions, post-feminist conditions, capitalist, neoliberal subjectivities that are embedded with all of this are being done through self-editing. You can see these things in action through looking at bodywork and through self-editing.
And wellness.
They're all built in. So it's a good way of exploring these tensions, I think. And also a way of looking at all of the different range of practices that are going on. I mean, not everyone like orients to these things,
there's affordances as well as the risks, there's pleasure as well as the kind of ugly feelings.
Totally. And it's important to look at the ugly feelings aspects of it, from the kind of gendered politics angle, to look at, you know, what are the conditions of femininity, how are they, you know, are they being intensified? We're also trying to find if there's moments of like escape, or ways that people are, you know, working with these things ironically, or challenging them, or trying to queer them. Not finding as much as that as I hoped so far. But it is really interesting talking about these issues in groups of people, so you can see the kind of the paradoxes in real time. Like, they'll be talking about like, it looks so good, and like really enjoying it, but then they'll like next minute be like, but then it's also this, and it's all these things together. But I think it is, you can pull them apart and look at the different aspects of them in a way that doesn't just come back to be like, look at young people you know,
yeah.
so narcissistic, so self-absorbed, they just need to get off their phones. That's just the least helpful.
Yeah. Orientation towards it for sure.
The least helpful message.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really important to look at what people are doing, what their actual practices are, what meanings they make from the practices.
Yeah.
And then go from there.
Okay, thanks. We'll leave it there.